The Galactic Empire had not faced resistance in over 10,000 years. Entire civilizations had risen, advanced, and vanished under its expansion, each one reduced to data entries and resource yields. War was no longer conflict. It was procedure. When Earth entered their observation range, it was categorized in seconds. Pre-industrial tendencies still present. Fragmented governance. No unified planetary defense. No interstellar capability. No strategic value beyond biological and mineral extraction. A routine operation. The order moved through command without debate. Initiate contact suppression. Begin orbital cleansing. Deploy ground forces for stabilization. There was no anticipation of difficulty. The first wave struck without warning. Kinetic bombardments tore through atmosphere and infrastructure simultaneously. Urban centers collapsed before alarms could finish sounding. Energy grids failed in cascading sequences. Satellites blinked out in synchronized silence. Billions died in the opening hours. The Empire recorded it as efficiency. Ground forces followed immediately. Precision units deployed into surviving regions, eliminating resistance pockets and securing terrain. Their doctrine was flawless: overwhelming force, rapid dominance, zero recovery window. At first, everything aligned with projections. Human forces were disorganized. Military responses were delayed and inconsistent. Communication breakdowns prevented coordination. Resistance appeared sporadic, emotional, and ineffective. Exactly as expected. But then the reports began to shift. Isolated engagements lasted longer than predicted. Small groups of survivors held positions beyond calculated thresholds. Improvised defenses began appearing in patterns that suggested planning rather than panic. Command flagged it as anomaly. Additional pressure was applied. Strike teams increased aggression. Engagement protocols tightened. Civilian zones were eliminated to prevent regrouping. Casualties rose sharply. And yet the resistance did not collapse. It adjusted. Units reported that humans who survived initial encounters behaved differently in subsequent engagements. Movements became more precise. Reactions faster. Decisions more calculated. Weapons that had been effective lost impact quickly. Tactics required revision after every encounter. The Empire responded with escalation. Heavier units were deployed. Advanced predictive systems activated. Behavioral models recalibrated to account for adaptive resistance. But the recalibrations didn't stabilize the situation. They failed to keep up. Each engagement introduced variables that had not existed before. Human responses began diverging from all known behavioral patterns. There was no consistency, no baseline to anchor predictions. The models began returning conflicting outcomes. For the first time in centuries, imperial systems produced uncertainty. Command dismissed it. Increase force density. Reduce engagement time. Overwhelm before adaptation occurs. The next wave was absolute. Entire regions were erased. Surface temperatures spiked beyond survivability. Atmospheric disruption ensured no immediate recovery. It was designed to reset the battlefield completely. When ground forces returned, they expected silence. Instead, they found resistance waiting. Not scattered. Not disorganized. Positioned. Humans had reformed faster than recovery timelines allowed. Defensive structures appeared where there had been nothing. Supply chains re-established without visible infrastructure. Movement patterns indicated coordination across distances that should have been impossible without communication. The Empire analyzed the data. No transmissions detected. No centralized command identified. Yet the coordination remained. Engagements intensified. Imperial units began encountering humans who anticipated their arrival before deployment. Ambushes occurred in zones that had not been active minutes prior. Defensive shifts happened mid-engagement, countering strategies that had not yet been executed. Prediction systems started failing in real time. Command issued immediate updates. Tactical variance increased. Randomization protocols activated to prevent pattern recognition. It made no difference. Humans adapted to randomness. Every variation introduced by the Empire was met with an equally precise adjustment. There was no delay. No learning curve. Only response. Losses began to appear in Imperial reports. At first, negligible. Statistical noise. Then measurable. Entire squads failed to report back. Recon units disappeared. Engagements that should have lasted seconds extended into prolonged conflict with unfavorable outcomes. The Empire adjusted classification. Earth was no longer insignificant. It was unstable. Further observation was ordered during continued suppression. Data streams flooded command centers. Combat footage, neural scans, environmental readings, everything pointed toward a single inconsistency. Human capability was increasing during extinction. Biological limits were being exceeded. Reaction times improved beyond expected thresholds. Decision-making processes accelerated without corresponding neurological strain. There was no external augmentation. No technological enhancement. The change was internal. Command initiated deeper analysis. Focus on survivors. Track behavioral progression across engagements. The results were immediate. Humans who survived combat were not just learning, they were accelerating. Skills improved between encounters at a rate that defied biological adaptation. Knowledge appeared without training. Coordination improved without communication. It was as if experience was not confined to the individual. Command flagged the phenomenon as critical. But the conclusion had not yet formed. Because the data revealed something more unsettling. The increase in capability correlated directly with loss. Higher casualty zones produced more effective survivors. Wider destruction led to faster adaptation. The relationship was consistent. The more humans died, the more dangerous the remaining became. The Empire reviewed the data repeatedly. There was no precedent. No species improved under sustained extermination. Extinction was supposed to weaken, destabilize, erase. Not refine. Command attempted containment through accelerated elimination. Reduce survival windows. Prevent adaptation cycles from completing. Faster strikes. Broader destruction. Continuous pressure. The goal was simple. End it before it evolves further. But with every escalation, the pattern intensified. Survivors emerged faster. Stronger. More coordinated. Imperial units began reporting something they had never recorded before. Humans were not reacting to attacks. They were preparing for them. Positions were chosen before deployment. Countermeasures executed before strategies fully unfolded. Movement patterns suggested anticipation, not response. Command reviewed predictive models. They no longer aligned with reality. For the first time in its recorded expansion, the Galactic Empire encountered a variable it could not control. And still, it continued forward. Because retreat was not a concept it had ever needed to understand. What it failed to recognize was that this was no longer an invasion. It was a trigger. And it had already been activated. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where humanity changed. The shift began quietly, buried beneath chaos, hidden inside the survivors the Empire had chosen to ignore. At first, the data looked like error. Neural scans taken from captured humans showed irregular spikes in activity, patterns too complex to map, too fast to measure. Synaptic responses fired at speeds beyond known biological limits. Entire regions of the brain activated simultaneously, forming connections that should have taken years to develop. Imperial analysts marked it as stress-induced distortion. Then the same pattern appeared again. And again. Across different continents. Different individuals. No shared environment. No genetic modification. No external interference. Yet the result was identical. Humans were changing. Not randomly. Systematically. Survivors of early encounters displayed measurable improvements. Reaction times reduced to near-instant execution. Motor control refined beyond trained soldiers. Decision-making pathways shortened, eliminating hesitation entirely. They were not thinking faster. They were arriving at conclusions before thought was required. Combat recordings revealed something more disturbing. Humans began acting with knowledge they had never acquired. Civilians operated advanced weaponry without instruction. Untrained individuals executed coordinated maneuvers under pressure. Improvised tactics mirrored high-level military strategies that had never been taught or communicated. The Empire isolated variables. There was no transmission network enabling coordination. No hidden command structure directing movement. No technological layer bridging individuals. And yet, information was spreading. Not through signals. Through something else. Every time a human unit was eliminated, the next group encountered the same threat with improved response. Mistakes did not repeat. Failures did not reoccur. Weaknesses closed instantly. It was not learning. It was inheritance. But not genetic. Experiential. The conclusion emerged slowly, resisted at first, then confirmed through repeated observation. Humanity had activated a shared adaptation mechanism. Every loss fed it. Every death contributed data. Every failure refined the system. Pain was no longer isolated to the individual. It became collective input. The battlefield transformed. Imperial forces executed a flanking maneuver in one region. Minutes later, a separate group of humans countered the same maneuver before it was attempted again. A weapon deployed successfully once failed completely the second time. Its effectiveness dropped to zero across all subsequent engagements. Humans were not just adapting to tactics. They were invalidating them. Command escalated analytical depth. Focus shifted from external behavior to internal process. Neural mapping confirmed the impossible. Surviving humans exhibited patterns of memory that did not originate from their own experiences. Synaptic pathways formed around events they had never directly encountered. Knowledge was transferring without communication. The Empire had no framework to process it. They categorized it as a biological anomaly. But anomalies do not scale. This did. Across millions of survivors, the same pattern repeated. Improvement accelerated in direct proportion to destruction. The system grew stronger as the population decreased. A negative feedback loop reversed. Extinction was becoming optimization. Command issued immediate directives. Terminate survivors faster. Reduce exposure windows. Eliminate adaptation cycles before they propagate. Orbital strikes intensified. Entire regions were vaporized to prevent continuity of experience. Ground forces were instructed to engage with maximum lethality, no prolonged encounters, no tactical repetition. It was precise. It was absolute. And it failed. Because the mechanism did not require survival of individuals. Only occurrence. Each event, each engagement, each death, recorded, processed, distributed. The Empire realized too late that it was feeding the system faster than it could suppress it. Humans no longer needed time to adapt. They adapted instantly. A newly formed resistance group encountered Imperial units and responded with strategies that had only existed in prior engagements elsewhere. Their movements aligned perfectly with countermeasures developed by entirely different survivors. There was no delay. No transition. Only execution. Imperial predictive models began collapsing under the weight of inconsistency. Inputs no longer produced reliable outputs. Variables multiplied without limit. Probabilities flattened into uncertainty. For the first time, simulation engines returned non-conclusive results. Command attempted to compensate. Randomization protocols deployed at full scale. Tactics generated without pattern, without repetition, without logic. It changed nothing. Humans adapted to randomness itself. They stopped relying on prediction. They shifted to recognition. Micro-patterns. Behavioral fragments. Decision tendencies measured in fractions of a second. Even chaos became readable. Imperial forces encountered resistance that did not react to what was happening, but to what was about to happen. The distinction became critical. Because reaction could be outpaced. Anticipation could not. Losses increased. Not dramatically at first. Then steadily. then beyond acceptable thresholds. Entire units vanished without meaningful resistance. Engagements ended before command could process initial data. Reinforcements arrived to find silence where conflict should have been ongoing. The Empire increased force again. More ships. More weapons. More pressure. The result was consistent. More data for humanity. More refinement. More acceleration. The system was no longer stabilizing. It was compounding. Every engagement made the next one harder. Every loss made humanity sharper. Every attempt to destroy them made them more complete. Command reached a conclusion it could no longer avoid. They were not suppressing an enemy. They were constructing one. And it was happening faster than they could stop it. The final escalation was authorized. Planetary sterilization across multiple zones simultaneously. No survivors. No continuity. No data propagation. Total reset. The strikes executed flawlessly. Entire regions erased in synchronized precision. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then movement returned. Faster than before. Stronger than before. Coordinated beyond previous limits. The system had not been disrupted. It had been amplified. Because the scale of destruction had fed it more than any previous engagement. And now, for the first time since the invasion began, the Empire understood the pattern completely. They had not been fighting resistance. They had been activating evolution. And it was no longer controllable. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible across every engagement, every report, every system the Empire relied on to maintain control. They were losing. Not in isolated incidents, not in marginal skirmishes, but consistently, measurably, and accelerating. Imperial fleets entered contested zones and failed to establish dominance. Strike patterns that had worked flawlessly for centuries collapsed within minutes. Ships encountered resistance that moved before targeting systems could lock. Humans were no longer responding to the Empire. They were operating ahead of it. Command systems attempted recalibration. Predictive engines processed incoming data at maximum capacity, searching for stability, for pattern, for anything that could be used to regain control. There was none. Because the patterns were changing faster than the systems designed to track them. A fleet deployed into low orbit above a major resistance zone. Standard suppression sequence initiated. Atmospheric disruption, targeted bombardment, ground insertion. The outcome was predetermined. It always had been. Except this time, the fleet never completed its sequence. Before weapons could discharge, system failures spread across multiple vessels simultaneously. Navigation controls locked. Targeting arrays misaligned. Internal networks experienced cascading overrides. No external signal was detected. No intrusion pathway identified. Yet the systems were compromised. Moments later, the fleet went dark. No explosion. No distress signals. Just absence. Command flagged it as catastrophic anomaly. Then it happened again. And again. Different regions. Different fleets. Identical outcome. Humans were no longer confined to physical combat. They were interacting with systems they had never been trained to access, rewriting functionality in real time, bypassing safeguards that had never been breached. Captured fragments of Imperial technology accelerated the process. What once took decades to reverse engineer was understood in hours. Then minutes. Then instantly. Human forces began deploying modified versions of Imperial systems against them, not as copies, but as improvements. Weapons adjusted mid-use. Energy outputs recalibrated dynamically. Defensive systems adapted while under fire, correcting weaknesses as they were exposed. Technology was no longer static. It evolved alongside them. Ground engagements deteriorated even faster. Imperial units reported enemies that moved without hesitation, without miscommunication, without delay. Small groups executed maneuvers with precision that exceeded elite military coordination. There were no commands given. No signals exchanged. Yet every movement aligned perfectly. Humans were not acting as individuals. They were acting as a synchronized network of independent minds, each one contributing, each one receiving, all operating with the same expanding pool of experience. Not a hive. No central control. Which made it worse. Because there was no single point of failure. Eliminating one group did not disrupt the whole. It refined it. Every defeat became correction. Every encounter became improvement. The Empire attempted to fragment them. Divide surviving populations. Isolate regions. Disrupt any possibility of coordination. The strategy failed before it could stabilize. Isolation had no effect. Separated groups adapted at the same rate as connected ones. Knowledge continued to appear where it had never been transmitted. Distance meant nothing. Loss still fed the system. And the system was now operating at a scale the Empire could no longer match. Command issued full-spectrum escalation. All fleets redirected. Maximum force authorized across every active zone. Overwhelmed through sheer volume before further adaptation could occur. The largest coordinated assault in Imperial history was launched. It did not achieve superiority. It revealed the final imbalance. Human forces did not meet the assault directly. They dismantled it. Not through resistance, but through anticipation. Attack vectors were intercepted before formation. Fleet movements countered before completion. Strategic objectives neutralized before execution. Every layer of the assault collapsed in sequence. Not randomly. Systematically. The Empire's greatest strength, its ability to plan, to coordinate, to execute at scale, had been mirrored then surpassed. Because humans were no longer limited by planning cycles. They processed outcomes as they happened. Adjusted instantly. Executed without delay. Time itself had become an advantage for them. Because every second added information. Every action refined response. The Empire attempted its final measure. A system-wide purge designed to erase the origin point completely. Earth would be removed from existence. No survivors. No data. No continuation. The operation required precision beyond anything previously attempted. It never reached completion. Before the command sequence finalized, interference disrupted execution pathways. Energy channels destabilized. Control systems lost synchronization. Human forces had already accounted for it. They had identified the pattern of escalation, predicted the final measure, and positioned themselves within the system before it could be activated. Not physically. Functionally. They did not stop the attack. They made it impossible. For the first time, Imperial command structures failed to issue a successful order. Not delayed. Not disrupted. Prevented. Silence spread through the network. Because there was no longer a path forward that produced victory. Every option had already been countered. Every strategy already invalidated. The Empire had reached a point it had never encountered. Not resistance. Not stalemate. Irrelevance. They were no longer controlling the war. They were reacting to it. And they were reacting too slowly. Because humanity was no longer catching up. It had already moved beyond them. And it was still accelerating. The Empire did not announce defeat. It simply stopped answering. Across occupied systems, command channels fell silent one by one. Fleets that once projected dominance no longer transmitted orders. Strategic relays returned empty signals. Entire sectors went dark without explanation. There was no final engagement to mark the end. No decisive clash. Just disappearance. Attempts to regroup failed before they began. Remaining Imperial units tried to consolidate positions, establish fallback zones, rebuild command hierarchies. Each attempt collapsed instantly. Coordinates were exposed before fleets could arrive. Hidden installations were identified without scans. Defensive perimeters were breached without warning. There was no delay between action and consequence. Because there was no longer a gap in understanding. Humanity operated with total awareness of every move the Empire could make. Not because they had seen it before, but because they could derive it. Patterns, probabilities, intent, processed, and resolved before execution. Imperial officers began to understand the situation in fragments. They were not being hunted in the traditional sense. They were being solved. Every decision reduced to an outcome. Every outcome already accounted for. Escape routes closed before they were chosen. Reinforcements intercepted before deployment. Countermeasures rendered ineffective before activation. There was no uncertainty left in the system. Only inevitability. The Empire had built its power on control. On predictability. On the assumption that superior force could shape any conflict into a manageable outcome. That assumption no longer held. Because humanity did not rely on control. It thrived in conditions the Empire could not process. Uncertainty. Pressure. Loss. Where other species destabilized, humans reorganized. Where systems broke, they adapted. Where defeat occurred, they refined. The mechanism that had activated during the invasion had not stopped evolving. It had expanded. What began as shared experience became shared comprehension. Individual perspective merged into a collective understanding that required no coordination, no transmission, no command. Every human operated independently. And yet, no human operated alone. The distinction erased the Empire's final advantage. There was no central target to eliminate. No command structure to dismantle. No singular intelligence to disrupt. Eliminating one human changed nothing. It strengthened everything. Because every loss still contributed. Every failure still refined. The Empire recognized it too late. Their doctrine had never included retreat. Withdrawal was not part of their design. Every conflict had ended with absorption or eradication. Now, for the first time, they attempted to disengage. Fleets redirected away from human-controlled regions. Remaining assets pulled back toward distant sectors. Orders issued to preserve what remained. The outcome was unchanged. Retreat paths were predicted and intercepted. Navigation routes compromised before execution. Supply lines severed before stabilization. There was no exit. Not because humanity blocked it, but because humanity understood it. And understanding was enough. The collapse accelerated. Without command cohesion, imperial systems fragmented. Autonomous units acted without coordination, making decisions that conflicted with one another. Defensive actions exposed weaknesses. Offensive attempts created openings. Every mistake amplified. Every response degraded. What had once been a unified force became disjointed, inefficient, vulnerable. Humanity did not rush the process. It allowed it. Applied pressure only where necessary. Removed key elements with precision. Let instability consume what remained. Because there was no urgency. Time no longer worked against them. Every passing moment added clarity. Expanded capability. Reinforced dominance. Eventually, there was nothing left to oppose. No fleets capable of engagement. No command structures capable of coordination. No strategies capable of producing resistance. The Empire ceased to exist as a functional entity. Not destroyed in a single moment, but reduced to irrelevance across every system it once controlled. In the silence that followed, humanity remained. Changed, but not erased. The connection persisted. The flow of shared knowledge continued. Experience moved freely between individuals, shaping decisions, refining actions, guiding outcomes. They were no longer limited by isolation. But they were not stripped of identity. Each human still chose, still acted, still existed as an individual mind. The difference was in what they carried. The weight of billions. Not as loss. As foundation. Everything the Empire had tried to erase had become the source of humanity's strength. Every life taken had contributed to what came after. Every mistake had been corrected. Every weakness removed. The galaxy adjusted to the absence. Worlds once under Imperial control stabilized slowly, uncertain at first, then recognizing the shift. There was no new empire rising to replace the old. No imposed structure, no enforced rule. Humanity did not expand through domination. It existed through presence, unchallenged, because nothing remained capable of challenging it. The Empire had relied on power to maintain order. Humanity had relied on survival to transcend it. And survival had proven stronger. There was no declaration marking the end. No signal broadcast across the stars. It was understood without words. The dominant force in the galaxy had changed. Not through conquest. Through evolution. And the final realization, carried across what remained of the Empire's scattered remnants, was simple. They had not encountered an enemy. They had uncovered an inevitability. A species that did not weaken under pressure. Did not break under loss. Did not stop improving. And once that process began, there was nothing left that could stand against it.